Hi, this is Angela Galloway, and we are in Math 146. We are in the middle of Unit 2. Right now, we'll be covering Section 13.2 about consumer credit. So this is the second video that we've had for Chapter 13. Consumer credit refers to borrowing money to finance the purchase of cars, furniture, appliances, and many other large things. There's two types that we're going to talk about in this section. One is installment or closed-end credit. This is when you borrow a set amount up front and then pay a series of equal installments until the loan is paid off. That's pretty common with furniture or appliances, cars, you'll see done that way. The second way is revolving or open-ended loans. This has no fixed number of installments. The consumer continues to pay until there's no balance owed, and this would be credit cards when we use those, because you're constantly buying new things or paying off things. And so there's no like end date where you have to pay everything off by. There's no fixed number of installments. It's just open-ended. So that's the difference in the closed end and then open end. Okay, so we're going to talk about those two things. First, we're going to talk about installment loans, and we talk about add-on interest with installment loans. And actually, add-on interest is just simple interest. So it's really just a continuation of our first section. It's just looking at it in a different way. So add-on interest, interest calculated by the simple interest formula, which we've seen before, the I equals PRT, and then it's added on to the principal borrowed. So it ends up that the amount to be repaid is equal to the principal borrowed plus that interest that we just calculated. And you'll notice that ends up equaling this formula, which is the same formula we've seen before, right? This formula was equal to A, which was our amount, or the total amount of the loan at the end. And so this is the same thing. Just now we're thinking about it with, okay, I bought something. I want to know how much I'm going to have to end up repaying at the end of this closed-end loan. So let's do an example. Mike has to buy a new central air conditioning unit for his house. It costs $5,600. So that's our principal there. He had a down payment of $2,000 though, and financed the rest at 5% add-on interest for 3 years. How much interest will he end up paying? All right, so something new in this section is that we might have down payments, all right? And so you probably know when you buy a large appliance, a car, a house, which we'll talk about in a later section. But whenever you buy a very large item, you're probably going to put some sort of down payment on it, because you know that the more money you borrow, the higher the interest is going to be that's calculated off of that, right? So if you can pay off a little up front, then that can make your finance charge or your interest be a little less over time, right? So here we have a down payment of 2,000. So the first thing we need to figure out is, what is the amount financed? So we had the $5,600 was the cost, but we paid 2,000 of it. So you have a amount financed of 3,600. So that's how much you're actually borrowing. Then we calculate the interest just based off of that amount financed, right? So we do the 3,600 times the rate. The rate here is 5%, so 0.05, times 3, because it says for 3 years, right? And we always do time in years. So we do 3,600 times 0.05 times 3, and we get 540, and that is how much interest he will end up paying. Now, another word for interest is finance charge. So I don't want you to be confused by that if you happen to see on some of the homework that it mentions a finance charge. Okay, finance charge is the same thing as interest, just another way of saying it. Oh, I'm sorry. I bet that was really loud on the video, and I'm sorry about that. But the reason why it's called a finance charge is because that is the amount that you're charged because you had to finance whatever you were buying, right? So if you were able to pay this $5,600 for the air conditioning unit right away, then you wouldn't have a finance charge, right? You'd get to pay it and you'd be done with it. But because you couldn't, they are going to charge you for financing whatever you had left over. So that is why finance charge and interest actually mean the same thing. So here's an example that kind of goes through some different things your homework could ask you for. So in some of these problems, they could ask you for the total amount to be repaid. They could ask you for the finance charge, the monthly payment, the total cost. So there's several different ways they could ask a question. They're all referencing the add-on interest, but there's just different steps that we might have to go through to get the answer they're wanting. So Susan wants to buy a new couch for her apartment. She finds one she likes for $1,500. She pays $200, so that's her down payment, and agrees to pay the balance at 6% add-on rate for 2 years. Find the total amount to be repaid. So how much is she going to end up having to repay? Well, she's going to have to repay how much she borrows, right? The financed amount plus the interest. Okay? So the amount financed, which is this area, right, is going to be the $1,500 minus her down payment, and that gives us $1,300. So she financed $1,300. Now we can find the interest based off of that financed number there. So the $1,300 times our rate was 6%, so 0.06. Our time is 2 years, so we get $156. So this is the 1,300 is the amount financed. This is the interest, and now this will be the total amount to be repaid. We'll have to add those together and get 1,456. Now in B, that's something we didn't really cover in section 1 and wants us to calculate the monthly payment. Now we can do that because with the add-on interest, we assume that you're going to be paying the same amount monthly, right? Just like you do your car payment, or if you bought a couch or an air conditioning or whatever, you kind of pay the same thing every month, right? So we can figure this out because we see that we're going to be paying this for 2 years, right? 2 years here means how many months? Well, 24 months, right? Because these are going to be monthly payments. 1456 comes from here. That's the total amount we have to repay. So we take the total amount we have to repay divided by the total number of months, and we get $60.67. Also, just a side note, they will talk about rounding to the nearest cent. Cent means 2 decimal places, so don't let that confuse you, okay? If it says the nearest cent, they want it to the uh, nearest hundredth. If so, 2 decimal places. If they say they want it to the nearest dollar, of course you would just round it to that whole number there, okay? But usually it's going to say the nearest cent. The total cost of the purchase, including finance charges. So this couch cost $1,500, but how much are we going to end up paying for it, right? So it costs $1,500. We end up paying an additional $156 in finance charges. So the cost of the couch after these 2 years will be $1,656. Okay, so that's good to know at the end, how much is this actually going to cost me? Because maybe once you realize how much the interest is going to be, you might say, I'm just going to wait a few months to buy this couch. I'm going to save up some more money, and then I won't have to pay as much in my finance charges. Or you might say, well, I'm never going to have this $1,500 saved up. I really need the couch right now, and so I'm willing to deal with that $156 finance charge. So that's something you want to think of as we're going through these. Don't just think of them as math problems. Think about, how does this apply to your life? When your air conditioning breaks down, or when you're buying a house, or when you're getting a car, thinking about how that down payment affects the interest payments over time, and how that interest rate is going to affect how much you have to pay monthly and all that. So that's what we're trying to learn here. Okay, the next part we talk about, this is still in section 13.2. We're going to talk about revolving loans. So revolving loans are what we talk about with credit cards. So it's revolving, right? How much you pay is revolving, how much you owe is revolving. It's constantly changing because generally with credit cards, we are putting new things on there every month, as well as paying just different amounts based on what our total is, right? So let's see what I want to talk about here. The required monthly payment can vary. You might have a set minimum, or you could pay all the way up to the full balance. So because it varies, that is why this is a revolving loan. Sorry, I didn't mean to mark through there. I thought I had my highlighter on. So it can vary from a set minimum up to the full balance. Usually at the end of the month, you can get some sort of itemized billing, right, that tells you what you purchased and what you paid that month. Finance charges in revolving loans may include interest, which we'll talk about. There could also be just kind of so there could be annual fee, there could be carrying charges, etc. There could be some other things going on in there. Late fees, all that is what the carrying charges is talking about. And so you always want to look into that when you get into a credit card. Most revolving credit plans calculate finance charges, which is our interest, right, by the average daily balance method. And that's what we're going to do. The average daily balance method really is just a weighted mean. And we talked about weighted means when we did the Borda method back in chapter 16. So we have done something similar to that before, but we will cover that here. The weighted mean is based on the number of days that your account has been at a certain amount. Okay, so this is important credit disclosures. This is just a sample of what you might see when you apply for a credit card, or maybe when you get a credit card in the mail. You'll see something that looks very similar to this. And so some important highlights here you want to look at is, one, the APR. Okay, it's going to give you the APR is 22.9%. So now that we've been working on, interest rates and all that, you may have wondered, how does that apply to like the credit cards I have? Because it is going to be a little bit different. Um, if you see that your APR is 23%, you may have thought, oh my goodness, 23%? That's what I'm getting charged every month? That's, a lot. That's a big percentage, right? But this 22.9% is an APR. So remember, that's an annual percentage rate. So this is what you're going to be charged in the year. But since we're generally paying this monthly, we can divide that rate by 12, and this says that actually the monthly rate we're paying is 1.91%. Okay, so be aware of that. When you get those APRs, of course you want a low APR, but it just helps you to know that, if you have a 30% APR, that doesn't mean you're paying 30% every month, but over the year, that is what you're paying. So, we'd like to have a lower one. Method of computing the balance, it should say that, and most of them are going to say average daily balance. Now, there's a few different methods of doing the average daily balance. We do the one where you include new purchases, but you may read yours and see that it says like it doesn't include new purchases or some different things here and there. But overall, it's the same general idea of the average daily balance that we're going to talk about here. Okay, and another thing you might notice is down here, there's always the fine print, of course. And of course, all of this is usually pretty fine print, but this is the extra, extra fine print, right? And it says, if at any time you fail to pay the minimum payment due by the payment due date for 2 consecutive billing cycles, the APR will increase to 24.9%. Well, that's something you probably want to know, right? Because if that increases, that's also going to increase the amount of interest that you end up paying, and it may no longer be a very good deal. So maybe if you get one that has a really good intro rate of like 15%, and then after a year it goes to 30, you'll want to think about that, before getting that credit card or putting very much on the credit card. So in this section, I actually used to not teach or include this section or this part, the revolving loans, when I taught the class, because I felt like it was a little too difficult, and I didn't want it to be too hard for students. But then I thought, well, first of all, it's a college class, so I know, there's supposed to be some difficulty to it. But secondly, this is probably one of the most important parts of this section that you will actually use in real life, right? I mean, almost all of us probably have credit cards, and you might want to know, how are they getting this balance? And then you also can learn some tips for how to keep your interest as low as possible. And we'll talk about that as we go into it. So really what we're going to do here is not mathematically difficult, okay? It's just that there's several steps to it, and it can be somewhat tedious. But mathematically, I don't want you to think that, oh, look at it and just be like, I can't do this. This is way too hard. It's not the math that's hard, okay? Because this is just multiplying and adding, no big deal. But what you do have to keep up with is making sure you keep things in columns and rows and try to keep all your work done neatly. You should by now be actually writing out your problems on paper. I wouldn't try to do any of this stuff just like in my head or just using my calculator. I would have this stuff written down, so that if you do need additional help, you could come and show me your work, or you could go to the Learning Center here at Sky CTC, or you could go to a math tutor, or whatever and kind of show them what you're working on so they can see where you might be going wrong. Because it may be a very small part that you're missing and you think you're just totally not understanding the concept, but you're really just missing one little piece, okay? So I don't want you to try to just do all this in your head. Try to write it down and keep it as organized as possible, okay? So let's do this example. Jessica's MasterCard account for one billing period is shown below. If the previous balance on March 3rd was $209.46 and the bank charges 1.3% per month on the average daily balance, find the average daily balance for the next billing, which would be April 3rd. Generally, your billings are a month apart. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make a table here that shows the beginning date of the billing period and the dates of all the transactions in the billing period, okay? So they gave us this information up here. This is showing all the stuff that she did that month. She obviously didn't use her credit card very much, but she has a few things in here, okay? So you see that on March 3rd, that was the billing date. Then on March 12th, she had a payment of $50, okay? And I'm going to change this because that was a payment. Now let's look at the purchases. Then she purchased some clothes on the 17th. On the 20th, she had a mail order. And on the 1st, she paid for some auto parts, okay? So the yellow is our payment. These blue here were actually purchases. So now if we're looking at the running balance, okay? March 3rd was our billing date, and she started with $209.46 on her account, okay? Now, March 12th, she made a payment, so I need to subtract that off, okay? That's one of the biggest mistakes students make is instead of subtracting, they add here, okay? So remember, if you paid money to your account, the amount you owe is going to get smaller, right? So I need to subtract it. So I subtract the $50 there, and now my account balance is $159.46, okay? Then March 17th comes, and it says she bought clothes for $28.46. So now I add $28.46 because now I've increased my balance, right? Now I'm at $187. Here on the 20th, I had a mail order of $31.22, so I add that. And on the 1st, I bought auto parts, so I add $59.10. Okay, and then that's the last thing I had before the end of the month on April 3rd. Okay, so we're going to move everything we did here. All these totals are just going to come here. Okay, so I just did this as kind of just some side work just to get my running balance. Okay, so now what we need to figure out is the number of days until the balance changed. So we want to know how long did my account have each balance, okay? And the reason why we want to know that is because that is how the average daily balance is done. It's done based on a weighted sum, and it's weighted based on the number of days that your account stayed at that balance, okay? So on March 3rd, this was my balance. It did not change until March 12th. So that is 9 days, right? 12 minus 3 is 9 days. Then from the 12th, it went to the 17th, so it stayed at this total for 5 days. It went from the 17th to the 20th, so it stayed on this one for 3 days, right? From 219, or it stayed, I'm sorry, from the 17th to the 20th, we did 3 days. From the 20th to the 1st, that is actually 12 days. I think sometimes this one's the hardest when it skips over a month, you know, when it goes from March to April or whatever. But what you can think of is, you know, think of how many days March has. March has 31 days. So April 1st, you could think of like March 32nd, right? Because it's just one day after the 31st. So that would be 12 days, right? 32 minus 20 would give you 12. And then our last balance that we had was 278.24 right on April 1st. And our due date or the next billing cycle was April 3rd. That's where I'm getting the April 3rd from. So it only stayed at this balance for 2 days before the new billing date. Okay, so how are we going to use those numbers? Well, we're going to do a weighted sum that looks like this. Okay, we're taking the running balance times the number of days. So here's my balance, 209.46. It was like that for 9 days, so I multiply it and get 1885.14. Then here I had this balance, 159.46 for 5 days. I multiply that and get 797.30. Okay, so I do that for all of my numbers. I get a sum here. I add them all together and get this sum, and that is my sum of daily balances. Okay, so to find the average daily balance, I take the sum of daily balances divided by the days in the billing period, which are right here. Okay, these days in the billing period should correspond to how many days are in the month you're working with. So if I'm working with March, there should be 31 days. If I was working with April, there should only be 30 days, right? So if this total does not add up correctly, you probably, messed up something in here, like you said there were more days than there were or whatever. Okay, so you want to go back and check that if this isn't correct. Okay, so I put in this 6432 divided by 31 and I get 207.50. So 207.50 is actually my answer for this first one. Okay, the average daily balance is 207.50. Then find, now part B and C are actually much easier. Okay, once we found this, the rest is easy. The finance charge to appear on the April 3rd billing. Well, we do the finance charge based off of the average daily balance. So here's my average daily balance. I multiply by the 1.3% and I get $2.70. Okay, so that is my answer there for B. Finance charge, remember, is just the interest. And C, the account balance on April 3rd. So when I get my billing statement on April 3rd, what's it going to say? Well, I take this 278.24, that was the last balance I had here, and then I add my interest that I just calculated. So this will be my new balance on April 3rd, 280.94. Okay, so how could we use this concept of the number, this running balance times the number of days, if that is how our credit card is calculated? How could I use that to my advantage? Well, one thing would be if you were to buy a very large item, would it be best to buy it at the beginning of the month or the end of the month? Well, it would be best to buy it towards the end of your billing cycle because then that large purchase that will increase your balance, of course, will only be counted for a few number of days, right, until the new cycle. Then when the new cycle comes out, you could pay a lot on it or whatever, and then it wouldn't be counting as much to that sum of daily balances, right? Or if you do buy something at the beginning of the month, a large purchase, then you want to try to make payments as soon as possible so that when it does get recalculated down here, you haven't been at that really large balance for a lot of days. Okay, so you'd rather your largest balance count for the least amount of days, because then when you do that weighted sum, it's not going to count as much as if it was there for 25 days, right? So that's something interesting to know, that that is how your credit card is working. And some people do use that to their advantage, that they aren't going to buy bigger ticket items till the end of the month, and then they'll pay them off when they get that next bill, because then it's just not going to affect their weighted sum there as much. Okay, so moving on, I have another example that is a little more realistic, okay? And this one here, you see there weren't a whole lot of payments or purchases, but I made this one a little more realistic. I probably still use my credit card a lot more than that, but let's just say we only used it a few times a month there. So the activity on your visa for one billing period is shown below. If the previous balance on January 3rd was 209.46 and the bank charges 1.5% per month on the average daily balance, find the same things that we found earlier. Okay, so the first thing we're going to find is the average daily balance. Okay, so these are our transactions. So let's do our highlighter again here. So I'm going to do the yellow for purchases. I'm sorry, I'm going to do the yellow for payments. That's what we did before. So here I had a payment on the 10th, and I had a payment down here on the 30th. And then all these were purchases. So on the 12th, the 15th, the 17th, the 23rd, and the 2nd. All right, so what I did here was on the last one, it was set up where, here, let me go back here. On this last one, it was set up where we did a little mini chart just to get the running balance, and then we put it into this. But on this one, we're really just going to do that all in one column, so just all at once, okay? So on the 3rd, that was when we were billed, and it was $209.46. Then on the 10th, we made a payment of $50. So if you make a payment, remember you subtract the money. So I subtract $50 off. I'm now at $159.46. The next time I was on the 12th and I went to Kroger and spent $38.45. So I'm going to add $38.45 to this total, the 159, and now I'm at 197, okay? Then I spent $12 at Walmart, add that on. I spent 25 at Minute Mart, 8.92 here at Wendy's. Okay, so these were all things that I added onto my account. Then on the 30th, I paid $40 off. So I'll do my yellow highlighter and I subtracted 40 from my total from the time before. And then the last thing I did was I went to Kroger again, right? So I added 47.38 and now I'm at 252.01 at the end. Okay, so now that I've got all these totals, my running balance, I want to know how long did they stay at that balance, right? So the 209.46, that's what I got on the 3rd of January, and it stayed that way until the 10th. So it stayed there for 7 days. The next balance of 159 stayed there from the 10th to the 12th, so 2 days. Then from the 12th to the 15th, 3 days. 15th to 17th was 2 days. 17th to 23rd was 6 days. 23rd to 30th was 7. 30 to the 2nd was 3 days. And then the 2nd to the last billing, the next billing date, which was, it said February 3rd here. And that would be information they would give you. It stayed on there only 1 day. And you see if we add all these together, it does come to 31. We're dealing with the month of January, and January does have 31 days, so that is correct. So now that we've done all the hard part, all we have to do is multiply here. So multiply the balance times the number of days. We get 1466.22. Then 159.46 times 2. We get 318.92. Okay, so you're going to do that all the way down. And you get this total 67.92.86. So A says, what's the average daily balance? Well, I'm going to take my sum there, divide by 31, which was my number of days, and I get 219.12. Now B says, what's the finance charge? Which means what's the interest, right? So I'm going to do 219.12 times that percentage, right? 1.015. And that equals $3.29. Okay? So I'm going to take that $3.29, add it on to how much I had in the last date before my billing. So it was 252.01 is what I was left with. I've got to add on that finance charge, and so 255.30 is my account balance on February 3rd. Okay, so that is the end of 13.2. I'll make another video for 13.3, and it shouldn't take too long there to do 13.3, but I'll just make it a separate video. So if you have any questions about this, go through these, work through these problems on your own while I'm working through them and make sure you're getting the same answers. If you have any questions about it, please email me at angela.galloway@kctcs.edu. Or if you're in Bowling Green or near Bowling Green, feel free to come by the main campus of Sky CTC and see me in my office during my office hours. I'm in Building C, Room 8, which is the back of the Emporium Math Lab. So feel free to come back and see me sometime. I'm usually the most free on Fridays, but if you want to see my office hours, go to the instructor info on Blackboard, and it has all my office hours listed there, and it's also on the syllabus if you need that, okay? But you can always send me an email, and you can always contact me that way if you would like, okay? So I will get started on the next lecture, but for now, I'll be working on 13.1 and 13.2 in Unit 2. Thanks.